Welcome to the 20th Century History series. All podcasts are released under a Creative Commons license and are free for non-commercial use. Each podcast is self-contained and does not require listening to previous episodes. The author is Kim Sonderborg, editor is Philip Bird, and the editor-in-chief is Dr. Liam Brown. All episodes are read by Kim Sonderborg.
How did the Cold War begin? The origins of the Cold War. After World War I and World War II, it is hard to believe that yet another world war would take place in the 20th century, but it did. The Cold War, which began around 1945 and ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, is special for several reasons. It was one of the longest wars in centuries. It encapsulated the entire globe as countries all over the world had to choose sides in a competition between the world's two superpowers, the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. These two superpowers each embodied their own distinctive political and economic systems, and with them a way of life which both powers were ready to defend at all costs. And for the first time in history, human conflict had the potential to destroy the entire Earth as a massive nuclear arms race raged on between the superpowers. In this episode, we will look at the origins of the Cold War as the war developed between 1945 and 1955. We choose these years as the origin because the end of World War II in 1945 slid into a Cold War, and 1955 was the year when the two sides were firmly drawn up. West Germany was invited into the Western Defense Alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and this prompted the USSR to establish their own defense alliance, the Warsaw Pact. These alliances formed the two sides of the Cold War. The causes for the Cold War and the origins of the two spheres of influence are many and complicated. We will not go through them chronologically, but focus on three factors and how each factor contributed to the Cold War. The first factor is the development of the superpowers themselves, as the Second World War drew to a close. The fact that the USA and the USSR came to stand for opposing views on ideology, politics, and economy, and that these views became mutually exclusive, came to dominate the Cold War. The second factor is the power vacuum which came with the defeat of Germany. This power vacuum caused each superpower to apply their politics for strategic, military, and economic dominance over the weakened European states, where each superpower developed their own sphere of influence. And the third factor is that of mutual distrust and mutual fear between the superpowers, which could be seen both in the recent past, during the actual fighting in World War II, and in the near and distant future. In our conclusion, we will investigate the historiography, the historical interpretation of the origins of the Cold War, as this has changed over the past decades from an orthodox to a revisionist, and finally a post-revisionist interpretation of the origins of the Cold War. The first factor in the origin of the Cold War is the emergence of the USA and the USSR as the two superpowers of the world. Both considered themselves incompatible to the other in all respects, a notion which fueled the Cold War greatly and made it longer. The USA had the strongest air force in the world, while the USSR had the largest army, consisting of some 10 to 12 million Red Army soldiers at its highest. Politically, the USA promoted liberalism, democracy, and capitalism. The basic idea of this is to enforce as little control as possible over its citizens while still maintaining law and order. Economically, capitalism was based on free market forces. Since World War I, the USA had grown to be the world's leading economic power, with trade networks all over the world. The USSR considered capitalism equal to exploitation, with the rich upper class exploiting the poor and vulnerable working class. Since the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917, Russia, from 1923 the Soviet Union, had been the world's first, largest, and leading communist power. Communist leader Lenin from 1917 to 24, and later his successor, General Secretary Stalin from 1928 to 53, made all industry and farmland property of the Soviet state, to be owned and run by the Soviet citizens. Whereas the USA ran its economy based on the principle of supply and demand, if a product is desirable and the price is right, people will buy it, the USSR from 1928 organized its economy and industry from a central state planning bureau. 5-year plans set out country-wide targets for production and quickly brought the Russian economy up towards the level of the Western countries. The Communist Party was the only political party of the USSR and promoted a totalitarian state in which every citizen spent his every waking moment working for the good of the state. This might sound strange to modern ears, but the communists believed that capitalism was a thing of the past, a system based entirely on the rich and powerful factory owners, the capitalists, exploiting the poor and vulnerable workers, the proletariat. The communists claimed that critics simply did not understand the means and trouble necessary to take civilization to its next and final step, that of communism. They genuinely believed that they were creating a better world. The relationship between Communist Russia and the West was one of tension from the very start. Russia was not invited to join the League of Nations after World War I and was thus denied the chance of international cooperation. When invited in 1934, the West was still suspicious over communism but needed the large USSR as a possible ally against Nazi Germany. However, in 1939, when approached by Nazi Germany, Stalin shocked the international community by joining the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, clearing the way for a German invasion of Western Poland. After having been invaded by Nazi Germany in the summer of 1941, the USSR, now part of the Grand Alliance with the USA, Britain, and France, fought the Germans back towards Europe. Although Stalin already in 1941 requested the opening of a second front in Western Europe in order to force the Germans into fighting a two-front war, this did not happen until June 1944, and the Russians thus fought the Nazis alone. So, as we see, the first factor in the origin of the Cold War was in the incompatibility of the two superpowers, which were both the strongest with regards to military, economy, and political influence, and which saw themselves as completely opposite in all aspects of life and civilization. This sense of complete opposition contributed heavily to making the Cold War longer. And as it went on, the two superpowers found it increasingly difficult to approach each other. Democratic capitalism and communism both consider themselves universal systems. There can be no room for the other or any other system. As a consequence, the countries of the world would have to choose sides, militarily, economically, and ideologically. The second factor in the development of the Cold War is that of the power vacuum in Europe. The fall of Nazi Germany had left a political hole in the center of Europe, which both superpowers wanted to fill. As the Red Army had fought back the Germans all the way to Berlin, it had liberated Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Albania, and East Germany from Nazi rule. The people looked forward to forming their own governments and begin rebuilding their societies once the Russians had returned home. But the Russian army never left. Stalin wanted to keep these states as protectional buffer states against any future invasion. In order to establish them as communist republics, the Russians used a tactic known as Salaamu Tactics. They controlled the communist parties in each country. The parties would form partnerships with small national parties, such as the Polish Peasants' Party, in order to get seats in the parliament. When the seats had been won, the communists would slice off its partners one by one until only the communists were left. By 1948, all of the East European countries had communist leaders who were trained in Moscow and loyal to Stalin. This alarmed the USA, who in March 1947 introduced the Truman Doctrine. This stated that the USA would support any nation from threats either from outside or from within. This meant that US President Truman would work to contain communism so it would not spread further. Already from February 1946, the Americans had been worried about the nature of Soviet foreign policies. A young American diplomat in Moscow, George Kennan, had in his long telegram, which was 6,000 words, presented the USSR as a monolithic one-party state which wished to establish a communist world controlled from Moscow. 1 month later, in a speech at Fulton University in Missouri, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill stated that an Iron Curtain had divided up Europe between democratic and communist states. The USA also used economic tactics. In order to keep European states from falling to communism and to get the industry rebuilt and trade started again, the USA introduced the Marshall Plan in June 1947. European countries would get financial aid in return for securing democratic governments. Altogether, $13 billion were given in aid to countries such as Britain, France, Greece, and West Germany. Stalin denounced this as dollar imperialism, while the USA condemned communist repression of free speech, choice, and democracy. But the most important country was Germany itself. Both the USA and the USSR recognized that once it was rebuilt, Germany would form an economic, political, and strategic center of gravity on the European continent. The key point in the conflict became Berlin. Since its defeat in 1945, Germany had been divided into 4 occupation zones: a British, French, American, and a Soviet. The former German capital of Berlin, which lay 185 kilometers inside the Soviet sphere of Germany, was also divided up. In 1947, Britain and the USA joined their zones in a bizonia, and in 1948 they introduced a new German currency, the Deutschmark. Stalin saw this as an act of aggression designed to take over all of Germany and restricted Western access to Berlin. The 2 million West Berliners were now virtually hostages in the Cold War. The Berlin Blockade was the first flashpoint of the Cold War, and the Cold War threatened to become a hot one. Instead of direct confrontation, the Western Allies decided on flying in supplies to West Berlin. From June 1948 to May 1949, 275,000 flights ensured that the West Berliners had food and coal. In the end, Stalin gave up the blockade. The Berlin airlift did not solve the German problem. Germany would remain divided until 1989. The Berlin blockade and airlift actually established the division between the two sides of the Cold War, because in May 1949, the Western Allies combined their 3 zones to create the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. They also formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in which all members pledged to defend each other. In October, the USSR reacted by making their zone the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. When West Germany was admitted into NATO in 1955, the USSR formed its own defense alliance, the Warsaw Pact. The sides were set for a Cold War, which lasted until 1991. As we can see, the two superpowers both sought to extend their influence over Europe. The USA used political and economic measures with the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan, while the USSR used mainly political measures, putting communist parties into power with their Salaamu Tactics. No side can be blamed completely for the development. The Soviets had clear reasons for wanting to create buffer states for protection. After all, 20 million Russians had died during the Nazi invasion of 1941-43. Stalin could be right in thinking that the Western states were against him. The Truman Doctrine was a clear indicator of this. On the other hand, the Western countries could not accept a communist takeover of Europe. Both sides played their part in the division of Europe, and both were defending a political and economic way which allowed for no other. Already in 1950, the Cold War moved to Asia, when the USA led a United Nations mission to Korea to defend South Korea from a North Korean attempt of communist takeover. When the UN forces pushed back the North Koreans up to the North Korean border of the Yalu River, the Chinese sent 400,000 Chinese soldiers to fight back the Westerners. This marked the second flashpoint in the Cold War and resulted in a Southeast Asian version of NATO, the SEATO. The USA and its allies dared not risk a communist Asia, with China and the USSR as two enormous superpowers controlling the eastern half of the Earth. This brings us to the final factor of the beginning of the Cold War, that of mutual fear and distrust, and the nuclear arms race. These were both long-term and short-term factors in the development of the war, as they developed already during World War II and contributed to the split between the two sides of the war. During World War II, the USA, USSR, and Britain had formed the Grand Alliance, fighting to defeat Germany. But during the three conferences held in Tehran 1943, in Yalta in February 1945, and in Potsdam July 1945, the different aims of East and West became clear. President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill could not accept Stalin's desire for buffer states. And although these big three at Yalta could agree that Germany should be disarmed, demilitarized, denazified, and divided, there were no long-term plans for Germany. The final push came during the Potsdam Conference when the new American president, Harry S. Truman, hinted to Stalin that the USA had a new superweapon. Just 4 days after the conference, this superweapon, the nuclear bomb, was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Stalin was outraged for two reasons. First, the nuclear bomb shifted all powers towards the USA, and secondly, dropping the bombs on Japan meant that the USSR would not be part of defeating Japan and would thus have no foothold in East Asia. This, coupled with the fact that Stalin in Tehran 1943 had demanded opening a second front in Europe when the USSR was the only allied country fighting the Germans, and this had only been done in June 1944, led Stalin to feel that the Western countries were plotting to keep the USSR weak. He was probably not far from the truth. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings sparked an arms race which greatly influenced and prolonged the Cold War. Nuclear explosions and the destruction from radiation were so dangerous that neither side could afford to lose. In 1949, the USSR detonated its first nuclear bomb, and 3 years later, the USA detonated the first hydrogen bomb. The USSR quickly developed their hydrogen bomb, and in 1957 tested out the first intercontinental missile, which could fly a nuclear warhead across the Atlantic in about 30 minutes. Each side struggled to stay ahead in the arms race, and the sheer danger of the weapons made the Cold War more intense. As we can see, there was great fear and mistrust on both sides, which helped to spark off the Cold War. From August 6, 1945, the development of nuclear weapons greatly intensified fear and mistrust, simply because the weapons were strong enough to destroy the Earth. The world would live in fear of a nuclear holocaust for 4 decades to come. In conclusion, it is clear to see how the Cold War began. We have looked at 3 factors in the development. The development of 2 superpowers with almost opposite views on politics, economy, and basic way of life left no room for the other and forced the rest of the world to choose sides. The power vacuum in Europe after the defeat of Nazi Germany led the superpowers to compete for influence there. And fear and mistrust, combined with nuclear weapons which could destroy the Earth, widened the split between the two sides and held the entire world in a state of permanent fear for 4 decades. Historians have shifted in their interpretations of who actually started the Cold War. They fall into 3 key stages in the historiography of the Cold War, known as the Orthodox, Revisionist, and post-revisionist theories. The Orthodox View developed among Western historians in the late 1940s and early 1950s. They believed that the USSR bore the main responsibility of the outbreak of the war. Historians believed that Soviet communism wanted to take over the world and that Stalin's totalitarian state left no room for other political systems. The USA thus had to protect the free world. During the Vietnam War of 1955 to 75, historians changed their views. The revisionist interpretation claimed that America had overreacted to Soviet actions. The USA itself wanted to expand capitalism, and the containment policy and the Marshall Plan were mainly tools to create larger markets for Western industry. An example of this view is the American historian William A. Williams, who also wrote in 1962 that there simply was no evidence for the USSR being ready to actually fight the USA. The third view is known as the post-revisionist view. Post-revisionists do not seek to blame either one side. Instead, the war developed as a consequence of developments beyond the powers of both the USA and the USSR. Historian John Lewis Gaddis wrote in 1972 that leaders of both superpowers sought peace but were pushed by political, military, and economic forces within their own countries to keep up the hostilities. The post-revisionist theories continue to be developed to this day. They seem to be more structuralist in their perspective, often focusing on structural themes such as political and strategic factors. Also, the Soviet Union had their Soviet Orthodox historians, who all determined that Western capitalism and American aggression was the sole cause of the Cold War. As they all wrote in the USSR, being censored by the communists, no room was left for other interpretations. Only after the fall of the USSR in 1991 did Russian revisionist historians emerge. Many of them focus on Stalin's role in the development of the Cold War, blaming Stalinist desire for control as a main factor in the development. As we see, the origins of the Cold War have been analyzed through many perspectives over the past decades. The last, post-revisionist perspective is most prevalent among Western historians, while the Russian historians are still working mainly with debunking myths established during the 8 to 9 decades of Orthodox history writing. However, it is up to each of us to make our own conclusion about how, and especially why, the Cold War developed.
This concludes this episode of the 20th Century History Series podcast. Music for the intro and outro was made by Andrea LaRose, while the music in this episode was made by BOK. To download more of these podcasts or to leave a comment, please visit www.historypodcast.net. Thank you for listening.